Welcome to today's session, where our presenter will talk about SaaS migration and modernization, balancing strategy and reality. This session is a level 200, and in this session, you'll learn more about migrating and modernizing your tech stack with SaaS. Please join me in welcoming onto the stage ZP, our Senior Solutions Architect here at AWS.
Thank you, B. Thank you everyone for joining this session today. My name is Bappi. I'm a Senior Solutions Architect at AWS. I work in a team called SaaS Factory, and I help partners and customers build better SaaS solutions. I'll be joined by Litton from SafetyCulture, and he'll be joining the stage very soon with you. Before we start, let's start with the problem statement. What are we here to learn today? What are the strategies for? So maybe you have built an application for a particular customer, or maybe you have done some POC in the generative AI space, or maybe you have an application already which is popular and a lot of people are using it, but now you want to scale it to different markets or adapt it to changes very quickly. You want to grow beyond the region that you are operating in. So how do you do that? Is there a better way? Is there a guidance on achieving that particular goal, which not only saves you cost while you grow, but also helps you scale seamlessly? So that's the problem we'll be looking at today. So the main use case we'll be focusing on is you have an application built for your customers, let's say customer 1 and customer 2. How do we go from here to this modernized version of the architecture where everything is a microservice based and everything is tenant aware or a customer aware? What we're trying to establish here is all the services that you will have in a modernized version is not dedicated per customer. Hence, you will get the economies of scale as you grow beyond what you can currently do in your per customer version. Now, with this modernized version, there comes some challenges, like how do you onboard a new customer into this modernized shared platform? How do you even track cost for them? What does identity look like in those systems? To handle those, we'll bring something called SaaS control plane. So SaaS control plane will be responsible for managing the identity portion of it. It will also handle onboarding a new customer. It will also handle the multi-tenanted billing and all other complexities that arise in a multi-tenanted SaaS application. It's not only to manage and scale your SaaS application, but also it gives you a single pane of glass through which you can look into your entire system's health, the important business metrics that you are after, and also a tenant-specific health of the system, which is, even though my entire system looks okay, but is a particular tenant suffering from system malfunction or resource outages, all sorts of things will be the responsibility of SaaS control plane. Now, how do we go from the customer-specific version into a fully modernized multi-tenanted SaaS architecture? So the first option is very simple. It's we modernize first, and then we move to cloud. So take your existing application, start refactoring it, making it modernized with microservices, and then go to market. Hey, here's our new offering. Obviously, the experience of the customer will change drastically, and you only get to judge what customer think and test the market after you have completed the migration. And you can also start growing and selling to new customers and adapt to changes after you have completed the migration. So that's one option. Yes, there are customers and there are use cases for this particular approach. Option 2 is you first move into cloud with very minimal and minimally invasive changes to introduce the SaaS control plane. You go to market as is with your current product, and then you start modifying it incrementally. The benefit of this approach is you can dip your toes into the market and see, is your product fit enough to become the new SaaS leader? If you test the market early enough, then you can invest your time incrementally modernizing it and expand to new market. So the idea of this particular option is you do not disrupt your customer onboarding. You do not miss out any chance of expanding to the market. Rather, you just go with what you have and then give you a breathing ground or a bit of runway to modernize it on the go. Right. So let's look at the few migration patterns that emerges from the trends that we see in the market. So our main idea is to go from the one left-hand side, which is single-tenanted customer-specific application, into the multi-tenanted, fully modernized application. So how do we do that? One option is a full-stack siloed migration. That is, take exactly what you have and put it onto the cloud with some very minimal changes, which is minimally invasive, to introduce the concept of control plane. Your control plane should be responsible for onboarding new customers into the system, as well as integrating billing mechanism, because you definitely want to charge your customers for the usages of your system. The next thing that can happen in your journey is a layered migration. In this stage, we find out different layers that are separable from the entire monolith that you have. It can be the web layer, it can be some specific service layers. We find those, we modernize those, we make them tenant aware so that one single particular service layer can work for all of the tenants coming into your system. And the final stage on this journey is the service by service migration, or fully multi-tenanted version of your application that was previously running per customer. Now, this journey may not look exactly a straightforward journey for you. So before we jump into the patterns on how do we achieve that, we should look at few SaaS concepts, like a very minimal concept that we need to understand. How does a SaaS environment look like? Okay, so on one side we have something called fully siloed infrastructure, or resources that are isolated by AWS constructs or infrastructure level construct. It can be AWS accounts per customer, or it can be VPC per customer. It can be anything as long as they are fully separated. On the other extreme, we have pooled infrastructure, or all the resources are shared amongst all of the tenants in your system. In this version, we are not creating anything specific to per customer. Rather, all the services we have developed are fully tenant aware, and they work for all and every single tenant that live in your system. However, you don't have to pick one or the other extreme. You can always mix and match. You can have a combination, something like a bridge pattern, which can have shared elements of the system that are shared by all of the tenants, and you can also have dedicated sector, like maybe there's a sensitive part in your application that deals with PII data or payment data. You can have them separated per customer. So this is known as bridge isolation pattern. So from a very high level, your infrastructure should look like this when you're looking at it from where you are. With that in mind, now let's see how would we go about implementing those patterns, and how does our journey might look like from a customer-specific monolith to a fully modernized SaaS migration. So the full stack silo migration starts from here. You have customer-specific application, and we want to go here. Exactly as is, we just flip them vertically. So we are using some infrastructure level construct to isolate all of the resources, and they are deployed per customer or per tenant. By the way, I'm using the term tenant and customer interchangeably because they mean the same thing. So each customer has their own dedicated resources. So you might ask, how is it different from what I already had? So the difference is you are having a very minimal changes made to it so that a SaaS control plane can talk with your application plane. And this particular control plane will also be responsible for onboarding new customers and creating these particular resources that are provisioned per customer. So that's how you are getting the benefit of SaaS control plane, although very minimal, but it's a starting point. You have to remember, you are just starting your journey in this particular stage. SaaS control plane will be responsible for onboarding a new customer and just handle the billing at this stage. We are not looking for anything else. In the next step, when we have the SaaS application and the control plane separated and they are working together in harmony, that's when we can call it a SaaS multi-tenanted application. So let's look at an example of how to do full stack silo with AWS services. So in this example, we are deciding to use VPC per customer or VPC per tenant, and the control plane is built on the side. It doesn't matter how you build a control plane. It can be a fully modernized version using Lambda or containers, and it is responsible for onboarding a new customers and integrating the billing. It also has a service that deals with how to onboard a customer and provision new resources for this particular customer. So if we go on to the next slide, you will see how an automated tenant onboarding look like. Our journey starts from here. When your customer comes onto the landing page where you have, let's say, different plans to choose from, customer registers themselves with their information and picks up a plan, and then your tenant management system creates an entry for that particular customer into the database, and then it starts provisioning the resources. And that particular resources, when that is created, a tenant-specific URL is returned to the tenant. So imagine this flow in comparison to what you had before, which is a customer-specific resources. In this case, you have the exact same thing, but because you have introduced the SaaS control plane, now you can onboard more and more customers on demand, which previously you could not have done. You needed a dedicated ops team. So this is a start towards the final destination. We shouldn't take it negatively, but this is a journey towards the fully modernized SaaS version. Right. The next pattern will look at the layered migration. So what does layered migration mean? Again, you have your original system here that is developed per customers on the left-hand side. From here, we want to go to a stage like this, where we have some components of our architecture shared amongst all of the tenants. It can be the centralized identity provider, it can be centralized routing or web app. You will know better which layer makes more sense to extract out and make it shared amongst all of the customers. So in our example, we have shown you the identity, routing, and the web application layer made more sense to migrate and make it shared amongst tenants. Now, in this version of the pattern, or at this stage of your transformation, we will need something else from our control plane, which is how to do tenant-specific routing and how to identify which resource belongs to which particular tenant, or when should I go to a shared resource versus when should I go to a dedicated resource, because we're somewhere in the middle of our migration and modernization journey. So we need this concept of identity that belongs to a particular user, not only who you are, rather which tenant or which organization do you belong to. This is what we refer to as SaaS identity, and it will become clear in the next slide. So this is an example of how layered migration would look like in AWS. So in here, we are using Cognito as an identity provider, as a multi-tenanted identity provider. We are using S3 bucket supported by CloudFront to deliver all of the assets, the static assets like HTML, S3, and then JavaScript and CSS. And we are using application load balancer as a multi-tenanted routing strategy. And rest of the backend services that we have developed, it can be product service, cart service, shipping service, all of them are still dedicated per customer, exactly as it was in our previous stage. We haven't migrated them yet. So what would an onboarding look like? It will be exactly same as the previous one. In addition to that, we will be creating a Cognito user pool this time. And that user pool will be dedicated to per customer. So you can decide to use a dedicated user pool per customer, or you can decide to use a shared user pool for all of the customers or tenant in your system. But you need to have a key information bound to every user, that which is the organization that you're coming from, because that will become very handy in our next stage of the journey. Now, with that set up, how do we onboard a new user, not only new organization, how do we create a new user in our system? So when we talk about user, we mean user's identity, like what's your name, email, all of those claims and credentials, and we generate a user ID. However, in a multi-tenanted SaaS system, it is vitally important that every time you inquire about a particular user, you also know which organization they're coming from or which customer they belong to. So once you marry those two information together, we can do it in many different ways, but here we are doing it in Amazon Cognito user pool using custom claims. We are adding custom claims to represent the company or the organization data along with the user, and this is how we are implementing the SaaS identity concept into Amazon Cognito, right? Now we will see, once we have the SaaS identity represented, how do we inject that and how do we make use of that? So from your web application, when a particular user comes into the SaaS app, it goes to the SaaS identity or the SaaS identity provider, and it logs in and gets returned a token as a response. And that token is JSON Web Token or JWT. In that particular JWT, you have all the custom claims that represents your customer and also the user that is logged in. Now, what do we do with that? What we can do is from the web application pass the JWT to the application load balancer. That is our multi-tenanted routing mechanism. And that router can then inspect the token, figure out who the tenant is, and route the request accordingly, which backend it needs to go. Okay. So that's how SaaS identity would become important when we're sharing resources. Service by service migration is our last stage where we should expect to modernize everything. Now in this part, we expect to go from here to here, like everything is fully migrated and modernized and using microservices or independent services, but nothing is customer specific. Everything is shared for all of the customers. In this case, it will be important to have a fully matured SaaS control plane as well, including billing, onboarding, metering, and metrics and analytics, because you definitely need to know which customer is using your services and how much are they consuming, how should you charge them. So those questions will become vitally important in this modernized state. So let's see an example of how we do service by service migration on AWS. So you have this particular state on the left side, which is you have your per tenant or per customer services. It can be layered or it can be still in the first stage. So what do? You pick a service first and then you modernize and you get rid of the service. The reason for this is you have already set up the multi-tenanted routing mechanism, so it will work and it will adapt when you are migrating and modernizing one service to a modernized version, because you have already set it up in the layered migration approach. Now, once you keep doing that, at some point, you will run out of services to modernize, and that's when you have achieved the end goal that we wanted to achieve, right? And as I was mentioning, that analytics and logging and collecting metrics would become very important in this stage, because now you only have one service to support all of your customers. So how do you know who is consuming what part? How do you even build them? So we'll see an example, but let's first see how are we collecting metrics and what can we get out of them. So the login, identity, routing would remain exactly the same because we have done it before in the layered migration. Now this is new in the modernized version. When a tenant request comes in, you perform the identity verification, perform the login, get the token, and then when you call any service with the token that you are passed in, those services should start emitting logs and metrics through the libraries, through the services that you have injected as a part of control plane. And your metrics and log aggregation service would be collecting those. And as a result, we can develop a dashboard looking like this. It's a pretty dashboard to look at, but it's a meaningful one as well. So in this dashboard, you can see which customer is consuming what part of your system, what's their AWS usages, and then you can figure out how much do you bill them. Right. I know it's a lot to go through in the short amount of time, but what I will say is the summary, as a summary between all three approaches. Lift and ship works well. It's a very quick to go to market strategy, but you are still bound by the same constraint. Like you cannot really adapt to changes quickly. You cannot do a proper CI/CD and release quickly to the market or adapt to the market changes quickly. On the other hand, service by service migration to the other extreme is the fully modernized version. It gives you all the benefits of SaaS, but it requires upfront heavy investment from your side. So it's pretty much your pick. You have these strategies now, you know the reality of your organization, you have to pick your battle. Now, at this point, we have heard about the strategies. I will invite Tim to the stage to share his experience in the SaaS journey. Ladies and gentlemen, Tim, can you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you. Thank you, ZP. So you've heard ZP talk about the different strategies that AWS offers. I would have loved to have known those strategies about 10 years ago. Hindsight's a beautiful thing. But I want to talk to you about the SafetyCulture journey. SafetyCulture, we're based here in Australia. We started back in Townsville. Luke Anir, who's the gentleman here on the left, back when he was a little bit fitter and younger, started our organisation in his garage. Back then, there was about half a dozen people. We were counting customers as they were being added very, very slowly, but more importantly, this is where we started. And back then, our journey with AWS started about 10 years ago. AWS has been a key partner in our journey. Back then, AWS didn't have an Australian data center, so we were in US East. We were sitting on Couchbase. It was a pretty layered solution, but it was pretty simplistic. We had 12 services. There was a lot of growth going on. We were only servicing customers who had iPads at that point. There was also a little bit of a web interface, but over the years that has grown quite significantly. Our deployment back then, 10 years ago, was heavily script-based. A lot of AWS CLI, a lot of JSON config. Everything was probably just a little bit creaky, slightly automated, but very, very hand-rolled. Back in those days, devs could actually run our whole infrastructure on a single VM. We can't do that anymore, and I'll talk about that in a minute. One of the biggest things that happened to us, kind of by accident, is AWS put our application up on their store. Back in the days when Apple Store was pretty small, but we were front page. We saw explosive growth. Our application basically doubled in usage every 2 or 3 months. And eventually, we had to solve a few problems. This is what we look like now. So we've moved from containers on ECS to EKS. We have very much had a modernization story. We did start originally, like I said, in US East. We are still in US East, but we're now across 3 different AWS regions. We do that because we have customers who are concerned about data sovereignty, not because they're concerned about scale. Where we were 12 services, we're now over 300 services, deployed across about 7,000 pods, all sitting on EKS. And we're also, our data has gone through a modernization story. We did start way back then back on Couchbase with some replication into Elasticsearch. We're now sitting on Postgres with a mixture of Citus. We have over 5 petabytes of data. We do over, I think the last number I saw was more than 5 or 6 million inspections a month with customers, and over 1 billion checks with customers a year. So our infrastructure has grown, and AWS has been there to help us since the very first days when we started back in Townsville. We actually used the AWS Accelerate program to move into AWS. They were extremely helpful. If you haven't tapped your AWS people on the shoulder and said, how can you help us? That would be one of my strongest recommendations. You do that now. In terms of our journey with AWS, we've always kind of been at the bleeding edge. We've always been trying a bunch of different open source things. For example, we started to do self-hosted Kafka in AWS before AWS had it as a managed service. But part of our approach here is we will try some of those things, and as, can I dare say, AWS catches up and makes them a managed service, we transition from self-hosted to AWS hosted. We do that for a bunch of reasons. They're far better at running those things than we are, and our core competency is in the software we produce, not in managing systems. In terms of our future, for us, we're pretty excited. AWS continues to be a core partner in what we do. We are moving towards being listed on the AWS marketplace. That is going to make it substantially easier for our customers to procure our software, as opposed to going through their own procurement software process. We're doing a whole bunch of work with Amazon around some of the AWS services. We've built an AI gateway that is being plugged into our product, and therefore as AWS turns on more AI features, we can easily incorporate those into our product and therefore give them to our customers. In terms of scale, we're looking to do a whole bunch of stuff around exploring more regions. We're in the process of building out a much more of a multi-cloud capability so that we can set up AWS regions in Germany, in the Middle East, especially due to customer demand. And also because we want to set up more regions in the US, we see significant customer growth happening in the next year. We're already a $1.3 billion business. Our goal is to double that in the next couple of years. So it's exciting times. And the other thing that's really important for you is having an insight into the AWS infrastructure roadmap. We're going to start playing with Graviton instances, explore how our workloads work on those different instance types. I would strongly recommend that you go and check out the well-architectured section of the AWS website. There's lots of white papers there in terms of how you architect stuff. It's some of the stuff that we have learned over the period of time and that AWS has learned. Like I said, hindsight would be a beautiful thing. If we'd learned some of those lessons 10 years ago, our migration story into AWS and how we scale now will be slightly different, and I would expect a lot better. And don't forget to tap into those free trials. With that, CP, do you want to walk us through the reference architectures?
Thank you very much, team. So I understand the journey to SaaS may be not as simple as you may have thought before. So to help that, we have created something called AWS SaaS Builder Toolkit that helps your development team boost in productivity by 40 to 60%. That's a varying statistics. So we have built all of the components of building a control plane and injecting and integrating with your application plane. It's an open source toolkit. And now you might have a question on how do I use that? That's why we have built 3 reference architectures on how to build SaaS with SaaS Builder Toolkit using either serverless, EKS, or ECS technologies. So it's all up there in GitHub and open source. Your team can try it out, and we welcome any feedback on how it has helped you in your SaaS transformation journey. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining the session today.